The Soviet gunner never saw the boy coming. He was crouched inside the turret of his T-34, scanning the smoke-choked streets of eastern Berlin through a narrow vision slit, when the grenade tumbled through the open hatch behind him. The explosion was muffled by steel and flesh, but the tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from every seam, another iron corpse in a city that was already dying. By the time the surviving crew members stumbled out, coughing and bleeding, the street was empty except for dust and the distant rattle of small arms fire. No one saw the teenage boy on the battered bicycle disappearing around the corner, his satchel lighter by one grenade, his hands still trembling from what he had just done. This was April 1945, and Berlin was collapsing under the weight of 2 million Soviet soldiers. But somewhere in that chaos, one German boy had decided that surrender was not yet written in stone. The story begins not with heroism but with arithmetic. By late April, the Red Army had encircled Berlin with a force so overwhelming that military analysts would later describe the battle as less a confrontation than an execution. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded over 2.5 million men, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and 41,000 artillery pieces. Against this, the German defenders could muster perhaps 90,000 exhausted soldiers, many of them old men and teenagers from the Volkssturm, the hastily assembled people's militia that represented the last desperate scraping of the barrel. The city's defenses were a patchwork of barricades built from rubble, manned by boys who had been in classrooms months earlier and grandfathers who remembered the Kaiser. The outcome was never in doubt, but outcomes and endings are different things, and in the space between certainty and conclusion, individual human beings still made choices that altered the texture of history, even if they could not change its direction. The boy's name has been lost to history, swept away in the same tide of fire and collapse that erased whole neighborhoods and turned street names into abstractions. What survived were fragments, testimonies from Soviet soldiers who encountered something they could not quite explain, reports filed by unit commanders trying to account for inexplicable tank losses in sectors where organized resistance had already crumbled, and whispers that circulated among the remaining German civilians huddled in basements and U-Bahn tunnels. The accounts describe a figure on a bicycle, always moving, never staying long enough to be cornered, appearing in the smoke and confusion of street fighting with a timing that seemed almost supernatural. 27 tanks, the story said, destroyed over 3 days by a single unidentified combatant who vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Whether the number is precise or has been inflated by legend is impossible to verify, but what matters is that enough people believed it for the story to persist, and belief in war has a way of creating its own reality. Understanding how such a thing could have happened requires stepping into the specific horror of urban combat in Berlin's final week, a kind of fighting that turned every advantage of conventional warfare into a liability. The Soviet tanks that had driven across Poland and East Prussia with such devastating effectiveness found themselves trapped in a landscape specifically designed to kill them. Berlin's streets were narrow canyons lined with buildings that offered countless firing positions and hiding spots. Rubble from Allied bombing raids had created obstacles that channeled armored vehicles into predictable routes, and the defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, knew every courtyard, every cellar, every connection between buildings that allowed movement without exposing oneself to fire. The tanks could not maneuver, could not use their superior speed, could not bring their main guns to bear on targets that appeared suddenly from windows or doorways and disappeared just as quickly. They were reduced to crawling forward at walking pace, vulnerable and half-blind, relying on infantry support that was itself under constant attack from snipers and ambushes. The tactical situation created opportunities, but exploiting those opportunities required a specific kind of courage that borders on madness. Approaching a tank on foot, in daylight, with nothing but a grenade or a magnetic mine, meant accepting that you would probably die. The statistics were brutal and unforgiving. Most anti-tank fighters in urban combat were killed on their first attempt, or survived only because they never got close enough to succeed. The tank's machine guns could sweep entire streets. Its accompanying infantry could cover blind spots, and even a near miss with a grenade meant nothing against armor plate. Success required not just bravery but a combination of timing, knowledge of tank vulnerabilities, and a willingness to exploit the narrow window between detection and death. The boy on the bicycle somehow possessed all of these qualities, or perhaps he was simply lucky enough times in a row that luck began to look like skill. The bicycle itself was a detail that multiple Soviet accounts mentioned, which suggests it was not invented later but observed in real time. In the context of Berlin's apocalyptic landscape, it was both absurd and perfectly logical. The streets were impassable to cars, choked with rubble and abandoned vehicles, but a bicycle could weave through obstacles, could be carried over barriers, could move quickly enough to escape immediate pursuit but silently enough to avoid drawing attention until the last moment. It gave the boy mobility without the noise of a motorcycle or the vulnerability of being on foot. More importantly, it allowed him to retreat, which is the part of the story that separates suicide attacks from effective guerrilla warfare. Each successful strike was followed by immediate withdrawal, which meant he survived to strike again, accumulating a tally that would have been impossible if he had simply thrown his life away on the first tank he encountered. The mechanics of destroying a tank with a hand grenade are less straightforward than popular imagination suggests. Tossing a grenade at the outside of a tank accomplishes almost nothing unless you are extraordinarily lucky. The armor is designed to withstand direct hits from anti-tank rounds traveling at supersonic speeds, so a fragmentation grenade exploding against the hull is merely loud and annoying. The only reliable method is to get the explosive inside the tank, which means targeting the hatches. Tank crews in urban combat faced an impossible choice. Buttoning up completely, with all hatches sealed, made them safe from grenades but also made them effectively blind and deaf, unable to spot threats until they were already under attack. Leaving hatches open improved situational awareness but created vulnerabilities that a determined attacker could exploit. Soviet doctrine in Berlin favored keeping at least one hatch partially open so the commander could observe the surroundings. A compromise that made tactical sense on paper but created exactly the opening that someone willing to get close enough could use. The boy's success depended on understanding this vulnerability and possessing the nerve to exploit it under conditions that would have paralyzed most people. Imagine the approach, the moment when you commit to the attack and there is no longer any possibility of retreat. You are on a bicycle in the middle of a street being contested by two armies, surrounded by the constant crack of rifle fire and the deeper concussion of artillery. Buildings are burning, the air is thick with smoke and brick dust, and the ground is littered with bodies and debris that make steering difficult. Ahead of you is a 30-ton machine designed for killing, its engine roaring, its turrets swiveling slowly as the crew scans for targets. You pedal faster, closing the distance, knowing that if anyone inside spots you in the next 5 seconds you will be cut in half by machine gun fire. Your hand is already reaching into the satchel for the grenade, fingers closing around the metal egg, thumb finding the pin. The timing has to be perfect because if you pull the pin too early and fumble the throw, you will blow yourself up. But if you wait too long, you will not have time to throw before they see you. The first kill must have been the hardest, requiring a kind of desperate courage that borders on dissociation. But the second would have been different, informed by the knowledge that it was possible because you had already done it once. By the third and fourth, muscle memory would have started to develop, a terrible competence born from repetition. There is a psychological phenomenon that occurs in combat where fear gives way to a kind of mechanical efficiency, a state of mind where the body performs actions without the conscious mind fully processing the danger. Soldiers describe it as watching themselves from outside, going through motions that seem both perfectly clear and utterly unreal. The boy would have entered this state somewhere around the third or fourth tank, and it would have carried him through the rest of his brief, strange career as Berlin's most unlikely tank killer. The Soviet forces were not incompetent or careless. They were executing a battle plan that had worked across 1,000 miles of conquered territory, using tactics refined through 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. But doctrine is only as good as the assumptions it rests on, and the assumptions that governed Soviet tank operations in 1945 did not account for a lone attacker on a bicycle striking repeatedly across multiple sectors. Tank losses in urban combat were expected, even anticipated, but they were supposed to follow patterns that commanders could recognize and respond to. A strong point here, an anti-tank gun position there, a coordinated ambush by a defending infantry unit. What the boy represented was a category error, something that did not fit into the expected framework of resistance. By the time Soviet intelligence officers began to notice that reports of destroyed tanks in certain sectors shared strange similarities, that witnesses kept mentioning a figure on a bicycle, that the attacks followed a pattern of hit and run that suggested a single individual rather than organized units, the boy had already accumulated most of his tally and was approaching the end of his run. The psychology of the defending side in Berlin was a complex mixture of denial, fatalism, and occasional outbursts of desperate defiance. Most civilians and soldiers understood that the war was lost, that Hitler's promises of miracle weapons and final victory were delusions, that surrender was inevitable and probably imminent. But understanding and accepting are different things, and in the gap between them, people continued to make choices that seem inexplicable from the outside. Some chose collaboration with the Soviets, some chose suicide, some simply waited in cellars for the end. A few chose resistance, not because they believed it would change anything but because the alternative was unthinkable. The boy may have been driven by ideology, by Nazi propaganda that had filled his head since childhood with notions of heroic sacrifice and racial destiny. Or he may have been driven by something simpler and more human, by rage at what had been done to his city, by a desire to strike back at the invaders, by the terrible clarity that sometimes comes when every normal structure of life has collapsed and you are left with only the most basic questions of what you are willing to do and who you are willing to be. The 3-day window is significant because it represents the limit of what one person could sustain under those conditions. Urban combat is physically exhausting even for trained soldiers in good health, and the boy would have been running on adrenaline, fear, and whatever scraps of food he could scavenge. Sleep would have been intermittent and shallow, snatched in whatever ruins offered temporary shelter. The constant stress would have accumulated, degrading judgment and reaction time, increasing the odds of a fatal mistake with each passing hour. That he survived as long as he did suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary skill, or more likely some combination of both. But luck in war is a finite resource, and 3 days was apparently all that his portion allowed. The disappearance is the part of the story that transforms it from a tactical curiosity into something approaching myth. If the boy had been captured or killed, there would be a body, a record, a name. Soviet forces were meticulous about documenting prisoners and enemy dead, photographing faces and cataloging personal effects. German records, fragmentary as they became in Berlin's final days, still existed for many of the Volkssturm members who fought and died. But this particular boy left no trace beyond the destroyed tanks and the bewildered testimony of the soldiers who encountered him. The most likely explanation is that he died in the rubble, buried under a collapsed building or incinerated in one of the firestorms that swept through whole districts, his body simply one more among hundreds of thousands that were never individually identified. Or perhaps he shed his weapons and his identity, melted back into the civilian population, and survived to become one of the silent men who rebuilt Germany in the years that followed, carrying memories that he never shared because no one would have believed them anyway. There is a particular irony in the fact that the boy's actions, dramatic as they were, changed nothing about the outcome of the Battle of Berlin. 27 tanks sounds like a significant number until you remember that the Soviets had 6,000 of them surrounding the city, and that even catastrophic daily losses would not have prevented the inevitable conclusion. The battle lasted another week after the boy's disappearance, ending with Hitler's suicide and the German surrender on May 2nd. The strategic situation was determined by artillery and numbers, by the exhaustion of the defenders and the overwhelming superiority of the attackers, not by individual acts of violence no matter how spectacular. But wars are not only about outcomes. They are also about moments, about the things people do when the world is ending and all the normal rules have stopped applying, about the capacity for both courage and futility that human beings demonstrate when pressed beyond any reasonable limit. What makes the story resonate decades later is not the body count but what it represents about the nature of urban warfare and the unpredictability of human behavior under extreme stress. Military planners spend enormous resources trying to reduce combat to predictable models, to algorithms of force ratios and firepower indexes, to doctrine that can be taught and standardized. And then someone appears on a bicycle with a bag of grenades and demonstrates that the most sophisticated military machine in the world can be defeated, at least temporarily and locally, by one determined individual who understands the environment better than the invaders do. This is not an argument for the superiority of irregular warfare or a celebration of last-ditch resistance. It is simply a recognition that war, especially urban war, creates spaces where the improbable becomes possible and the individual can briefly matter in ways that defy the usual calculus of combat. The Soviet soldiers who witnessed the attacks and survived to tell the story were professional military men who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, who had seen every variety of courage and desperation that war produces. Their testimony carries weight precisely because they were not prone to exaggeration or mythology. They reported what they saw with the flat, factual tone of men describing something that confused them, that did not fit into their understanding of how the battle was supposed to unfold. A boy on a bicycle should not have been a significant threat. He should have been killed or captured in his first attempt, if he even managed to get close enough to a tank to make an attempt. That he succeeded repeatedly suggests something that the official histories and the strategic analyses usually miss, which is that war at the level of individual human experience operates according to different rules than war at the level of maps and divisions. The question of motivation is ultimately unanswerable, but it is also the most human part of the story. Why did he do it? The easy answer is indoctrination, that he was a product of 12 years of Nazi education and propaganda, that he believed in the cause and was willing to die for it. This may even be partially true, but it is also insufficient, because indoctrination explains why someone might want to fight but not why they would develop the specific skills and tactics that allowed them to succeed where others failed. There is a craftsmanship to what the boy did, a progression from the first fumbling attack to the refined technique that he must have developed by the end. This suggests conscious thought, adaptation, learning from each encounter and adjusting his approach. It suggests someone who was not simply throwing his life away but trying to survive while inflicting maximum damage, someone who had crossed the line from ideology into something darker and more personal, a kind of focused hatred that transformed fear into precision. The aftermath of the Battle of Berlin is well documented. The city fell, Germany surrendered, and the survivors began the long process of digging out from under the rubble and trying to comprehend what had been done and what had been lost. The physical reconstruction took decades, but the psychological reconstruction is arguably still incomplete. In the immediate aftermath, stories like the boys were unwelcome on all sides. The Soviets had no interest in highlighting their vulnerabilities or celebrating German resistance, even feudal resistance. The Germans were focused on survival and denazification, on presenting themselves as victims rather than perpetrators, on forgetting rather than remembering. Individual acts of last-ditch fighting were embarrassments, reminders of a fanaticism that the new Germany wanted to bury. So the story survived only in fragments, in unofficial accounts and veterans' memoirs, in the kind of oral history that gets passed along in quiet conversations but never makes it into the official record. Modern military analysts studying the Battle of Berlin focus on the large-scale dynamics, the operational decisions made by Zhukov and his German counterparts, the role of artillery and air power, the tactics of urban assault. This is appropriate because these are the factors that determine the battle's outcome. But there is value in remembering the anomalies as well, the moments when the script was temporarily disrupted, when someone did something that should not have worked but did. The boy on the bicycle was tactically irrelevant but symbolically important, a reminder that even in the most one-sided battles, even in defeats so total that they seem to have been foreordained, individual human agency does not entirely disappear. It persists in strange forms, in acts that are simultaneously brave and pointless, effective and futile, rational and insane. The bicycles that survived the war in Berlin became prized possessions in the months and years that followed. Practical transportation in a city where motor vehicles were rare and fuel was non-existent. It is entirely possible that the boy's bicycle outlasted him, that it was scavenged from wherever he fell and went on to carry someone else through the ruins, its history unknown to its new owner. Objects have a way of persisting through catastrophes that destroy the people who own them, becoming silent witnesses to events that no one remembers. Somewhere in a Berlin museum or private collection, there may be a bicycle that was once ridden through Soviet tank formations by a teenage boy whose name we will never know, and there is no way to identify it or separate it from the thousands of other bicycles that survived the war. The anonymity is complete. There is a temptation to end a story like this with a moral lesson, to extract some kind of wisdom or warning from the events. But the truth is that the story resists easy interpretation. It is not a celebration of heroism because heroism in service of the Nazi regime is morally compromised at best. It is not a condemnation of fanaticism because we do not know enough about the boy's motivations to judge them fairly. It is not a tactical manual because the specific circumstances that made his actions possible were unique and unrepeatable. What it is, perhaps, is a reminder of the irreducible complexity of human behavior in extremis, the way that people in impossible situations make choices that defy our categories and expectations. The boy destroyed 27 tanks not because it was rational or because it served any achievable military purpose, but because in that moment, in that place, it was the thing he chose to do. And for 3 days in April of 1945, in a city that was dying, that choice mattered to the men who died in those tanks and to the boy himself, even if it changed nothing about how the story ended. The ruins of Berlin have long since been cleared away, replaced by a modern city that barely resembles the nightmare landscape of April 1945. The tank traps and barricades are gone, the bullet-pocked buildings either demolished or repaired, the mass graves covered over and marked with monuments that speak in the careful language of collective grief and official memory. But history is not only what is commemorated, it is also what is forgotten, the stories that slip through the cracks of official narrative, the individual moments that statistics cannot capture. Somewhere in those ruins, for 3 days, a boy on a bicycle waged his own private war, and then he was gone, dissolved into the same chaos that had created the opportunity for his strange, brief, terrible triumph. We will never know his name, but the fact that we know the story at all is its own kind of evidence that even in the most comprehensive defeats, even in the most hopeless circumstances, human beings are capable of actions that surprise us, that resist our understanding, that remain stubbornly, inexplicably individual. The tanks are scrap metal now, recycled decades ago, but the boy is still riding through that smoke and fire somewhere in the historical record, forever approaching the next target, forever disappearing into the ruins, never to be found. That is where the story ends, not with answers but with absence, not with clarity but with the persistent mystery of what one person can do when everything else has failed, and why they would choose to do it at all.